Well, yeah, Ellis sent me an email some time ago and asked me if I'd like to participate, and I thought it would be a great opportunity because we're feeling a little bit isolated at the moment in South Africa because we're under lockdown. We haven't reached the peak of the first phase of our pandemic, and nothing seems to be working. Kids aren't going back to school. We're not allowed to go and eat in restaurants. We have a complete alcohol ban, no smoking, no sale of cigarettes, etc. So we're feeling quite isolated on the tip of Southern Africa. So it's just really great for me to be able to sit and talk to you about some of the work that I've been involved in over the last 20 odd years in South Africa. So maybe I should just start right away, if that's okay, because, and Ellis, I suppose it's, are questions allowed, or shall I try and finish?
Yeah.
Great.
If people have questions, pitch them in, or just identify yourself in the chat box, and I will open the mic up for, when we get to the end.
Okay, so the talk is called Aluta, Continua, and that has to be translated, the struggle continues, and it really has to do with the condition that we find ourselves in South Africa today, which is that we had liberation in 1994. We had a constitution, a fantastic Bill of Rights that was introduced. And aside from political rights, not much has changed in the country. We're still one of the most unequal countries in the world. We have great poverty, and we have cities that are as dysfunctional today as they were under the apartheid regime. And so the struggle continues. There's no magic switch that you turn on when you have a radical change like we had in South Africa, and you can expect that everything will get better. It hasn't got better. It hasn't got worse. Although, you know, we're in a very tricky situation at the present moment. So, you know, it's not that I'm despondent. I'm very excited about the future. It's just that I thought I would share with you some ideas about my country, which are not going to be rose-tinted. They're not going to be, you know, not presenting the truth. It's going to be quite hard-nosed, and hopefully we'll deal with some of the truth. And that's what I'm doing. This is a drawing that has meant a lot to me. In fact, it came out of a workshop that I was involved in Johannesburg in the 80s, when I ran a graphics workshop for trade unions to talk to people about how to design posters for trade unions to advertise events and so on. This is quite a famous image, but it really for me represents what in the 80s hope meant to South Africa. You know, industrial might. You have the clenched hand, which is a strong symbol in black liberation ideology, and you have the sawtooth factory roof, which talks about industrial growth and development. But before I get onto those ideas, I thought I might just talk to you about who we are as a practice, because I think we work in quite a different way from most other practices in the world today. We're small. We take on almost every job that comes our way. We do a huge amount of work, both large and small, which you'll see tonight. And I was saying to Ellis earlier that, you know, in a funny way, the period of isolation that South Africa endured during the 70s and 80s was both good and bad for the country. For architecture, it was probably quite good in the sense that we didn't get dislodged from our modernist roots in the sense of moving too far away from it. We remained earnestly committed to the modernist ideal of architecture being an important force for change in society. We realized that that's not necessarily truthful, but what I would say is that these following ideas have shaped our work over the last 30, 40 years and continue to shape it. And the first thing I'd like to start with saying that, you know, architecture is a practical art. It's brought into being in order to satisfy purpose, which dumps, for once and for all, in my opinion, anyhow, the idea of autonomous architecture. There are two things that I think are important in architecture for us, and that's ethics and poetics. And I think that I use the definition of ethics that comes from Wittgenstein, when he said that ethics is inquiry into what is valuable and to what is important, into the meaning of life and the right way of living. Equally, though, as architects, we're required as artists to make things that are beautiful, and we have the same pressures on us as an artist, a sculptor, or a poet would have, except that there's an inherent tension in the work that we do, and that is that we don't do the work for ourselves, but we do the work on behalf of others, and we get paid for doing it on their behalf. And I think that's something that really does, shape our attitude towards the work that we do, in the sense that we don't compromise what we believe in, but we take into account the fact that this work that we're doing is not for us, it's for others. The two principles that, the two things that give shape to our work and have guided the actual architectural work is just an engagement with the everyday and the social and political and physical context of our work. The everydays are very important for me because our country, moved from a white-based, racist system to something that was burst wide open in 1994. And we embraced the rest of Africa. We became part of Africa, but we found it really difficult. And, when we talk about a process of decolonization in South Africa, it hasn't even started. We've got a lot of work to do. Where do we start? And I think that I made a decision 20 years ago that where we were going to start as a practice was in engaging in the everyday practices of the world that we lived in. In other words, just keep our eyes open, look at what's going on around us, and try and make sense of it, and then to try and use that as a basis for developing the work that we were doing, rather than these far-flung ideas that you have floating around now about what African architecture should be. Africa, a continent of 47 or whatever odd countries is always referred to as one country, I know that, but South Africa is a strange and complicated place, and I think that it's going to take us generations to work through the issues that we face and to come to some kind of better understanding. So our work is located in the everyday, and by that I mean that, architecture must respond to program and be purposeful. It must be capable of adjustment and adaptation, which I'll talk to you about later, shaped by careful consideration of, domestic rituals and activities of people. And finally, I say this, although I spoke about architecture being beautiful, it can be quite ordinary, and it may even be crude or banal. And I think those ideas are things that we keep in mind all the time when we make the work that we do. This is an important mural for me, or poster for me, because it comes again from my life in Johannesburg when I taught at Wits in the 1980s. And it represents for me a pre-revolutionary moment when we were talking about change. But what's most important for me is in the background, the typology of buildings that you see located there, which is the double-storied school, the single-storied house, and the sawtooth factory building. And I've been locked onto that sawtooth factory building for a long time as a typology for no reason. I mean, it's got good reasons to be. You get, natural light from it. You get decent. You can induce decent natural ventilation and so on. But I think one of the unions played in liberating our country. A lot of press and a lot of coverage has been given to the ANC in exile and of how important they were in bringing the country to the negotiating table. And we haven't spoken enough, I think, in our history yet about the role that people living within South Africa played in bringing the apartheid government to the negotiating table. And at the top of that list would be the trade unions. The trade unions were fundamentally important in bringing about change in our country. And in a funny way, people recognize that, and they see the factory not as a place where, as an exploitative means of labor, of using their labor, but rather as a place, I think, of civic virtue, a place where the battle for freedom was fought and won by the trade unions on the shop floor. So in a funny way, in my mind, at any rate, I've always associated the factory with a symbol of civic importance and civic virtue, and it's played a fundamental part in some of the work that we've been doing over the last while. So the first project very quickly. I'm not going to talk about this as a competition we won in Port Elizabeth, which is the Detroit of South Africa. It's where all the cars, most of the cars that are made in South Africa, assembled in South Africa and are sold right throughout Africa. So it's a heavily unionized and highly industrialized city. And we won a competition to design a cultural precinct there, and we were commissioned to design 3-4 buildings, of which we completed 3, a museum, an art gallery, and a library. And these are some drawings that I made for the competition entry, but as you can see here, the sawtooth roof now makes its presence felt very, very strongly in the museum itself. And I think that there's a whole story about what goes underneath the roof, which is a series of memory boxes, which are very tall, 12 meters tall. But for me, what is important is the profile of the roof. And sorry, the reading of the building, I think, became quite important, because we've had some difficulties with the local community, but that doesn't have anything to do with our architecture. It rather has to do with some of the other political issues that exist in Port Elizabeth, which is part of the Eastern Cape, and it's a disaster area at the present moment. But the building itself, as an architectural work, worked very well. And people, I don't know whether it was a familiarity of the form or whatever, but it fitted within what people had expected of a public building. So this is the museum building. The second building that we did was the art gallery, which again picked up on the idea of a serrated roof, except in this case, the roof was adjusted to accommodate the purpose underneath, contained within the envelope, which really was to do with the display of art. So we made these gigantic big towers that were long and linear, and that brought lots of south light into the spaces below. Sorry, I don't know what's going on here. Sorry, I'm clicking the wrong side. And art gallery. And then the final building that we made was the library, which again had as you can see over here, a roof light, which was again calibrated to suit the purpose of accommodating computerized library access below, which is the first computerized library for young school kids in townships in South Africa. So, and then finally the building as it is today. We still have to build some theaters and an art school, which I think will probably start happening once the pandemic has been sorted out and we found a vaccine. But that's another story. So that was the beginnings, a kind of strange beginning to try and start to think about how to make a public building in a new South Africa, where in a sense, all the forms and the symbols that we come to associate with public buildings in the past weren't jettisoned, but we need to think about it in another kind of way. And, you know, I was really concerned about going into the everyday and searching within the everyday to try and find where that might be. I'm going to show you 2 projects now, which I think are really interesting for me, because they're both, it's the first project I did in my career, which is a church in Soweto for Desmond Tutu, and then a church which I've just completed now for an Anglican community in Somerset West. This is the St. Paul's Anglican Church in Soweto. It was the first building that I ever made as an architect in private practice. And it was commissioned by Desmond Tutu and David Nkwe, Desmond was the Bishop of Johannesburg at the time. David Nkwe was the Archdeacon of Soweto. And Ipelehengas in Jabavu White City in Soweto. And it was the place where Hector Peterson and his family worshipped. They were Anglicans. Hector Peterson, if you remember, was the young black kid who was the first one killed by the South African apartheid government in the Soweto riots in '76. And in fact, his body was brought to this site for the memorial service before he was buried in Avalon Cemetery in Soweto. So this church was built, there was an existing community center, and this church was built in the early 80s in commemoration or in memory of Hector Peterson. I don't know how, yeah. And it was a circular church where the service is very didactic, and it was very interesting because this used to be a place where the diplomatic corps and ambassadors and others would come to Soweto under the pretext of attending an Anglican church service, but it was in fact a place where they could meet the leadership of Soweto. And in fact, the service was a very long service because it was conducted in 2 black languages and 1 white language, English, for the visitors. And so the 3 quadrants in a way became symbolic of these 3 different languages in which the church service was presented. The back space, the back quadrant, was converted into an outdoor altar, where this is the church and the interior of the church. Sorry, there's one. Yeah, and this is the kind of use to which the church was put to during the 80s and early 90s. Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu came to this space, and the first big address that they gave in Soweto, the first big rally, happened in this large courtyard, and there must have been about 8,000-10,000 people there. So it was an important, symbolically important part of Soweto, the interior of the building. Now, what was interesting about that building was that I was simultaneously teaching at Wits at the time, and there was a very bright young student who was at Wits then, who became very interested in the church, and I remember taking him out there and talking to him about it. And then about 3 years after he graduated, this young architect came to me and told me he was going to join the church. He decided to give up architecture and become a priest. I said, well, that's great. You know, I mean, you've got to be led by the things that you believe in. And then about 10 years ago, which must be at least 20 years after I'd last seen him, he contacted me in Cape Town and said that he'd just been moved to Cape Town. He'd just taken over a church community in Somerset West, and he wanted me and him to make a church together, which was fantastic. So this is now the last building that I've done, which remembers the St. Paul's Church. It's a circular church, but on the other hand, it's a bit bigger. It's the same diameter as the St. Paul's Church, but it was a church that had to be able to be used for 2 different sizes of congregations, one of 450, which was the usual church-going congregation, and then a larger church going for special events and special occasions that could swell up to 1,000 people. So the circular drum grew a skirt that wrapped around it on 3 sides, and that then took over the additional numbers of people. And it was just really very interesting to work through making another church again, but this time with someone who was pretty smart. And even though he was now a priest, a minister in the church, he still carried on with his love of architecture. We had some wonderful discussions about this church remembering all the time the building that we made in Soweto. The circular drum, we developed a fantastic system of using angled bricks with holes in them for acoustics, and the acoustics inside the space works very well. So it's a very nice building, which I think works very well. And it was added onto an existing church. So the existing church is behind me, looking at this image here of the existing building, with a courtyard in between and classrooms on the one side. So this is the sort of, I suppose, coming back to thinking about architecture in a completely different time. In this case, now the building isn't brick, exposed brick. It's a white plastered building. This church is on the edge of an agricultural land outside Cape Town. So this is a reference to the Cape Dutch farm buildings that are scattered right throughout the area, which are plastered, painted white. Sometimes they're even lime washed, although this isn't lime washed. And so it has the same thing. And there's a 35-40 year period of time between the two. And the entrance to the church, you know, again, in South Africa, our cities are not functioning properly. We have streets which work, but our public spaces don't work. And we don't have any thickness to the thresholds in our cities. So this is an attempt to sort of try and create that thickness by bringing the entrance to the church right onto the parking area and then just having a hole in the wall. but then layering that whole so that you get views through it to the courtyard behind. And then these are images of the building, and the curved acoustic wall, which I think works very well. We actually use the church for musical performances now in Somerset West. So that brings the back and the present together. One of the things about Cape Town, which is extraordinary, is its landscape, and the landscape plays an incredibly powerful part in the way in which we read the city, although I'm not sure that it plays a very important part in how we read architecture. It seems to me that in Cape Town, when we make buildings that refer to the landscape, we kind of run away from it. We want to bury the buildings. Now, I'm not sure that that's a good idea always, but in this case, burying the building was a useful idea. This is a school, Wynberg Girls High, and it's a school that consists of 4 schools all joined together, 2 girls' schools, 2 boys' schools, 2 high schools, 2 primary schools, and they share common sports facilities. A real need for more classrooms in the girls' school and no space to build it. And the grey area there is a courtyard around which we had to build an additional 8 classrooms. This is the courtyard itself, which is, again, this business of the colonial influence on South African architecture. This was a postmodern thing that was built about 20 years ago, but it tries to recreate a typical courtyard that you would find maybe in Cambridge or Oxford, with a green space in the middle. The girls weren't allowed to walk across it. If you can imagine, they'd walk around the edges of it. And it was really it was a powerfully symbolic space. It was a dead space. The kids didn't use it. Anyhow, you could see Table Mountain in the background. And what they needed to do was to add 8 classrooms onto this courtyard. And what they wanted to do was to build 4 classrooms on top of that wing and 4 classrooms on top of that one. And they appointed us to do the work, and I refused to do it. And I said to them that if you build the classrooms over here, you destroy the view of the mountain. And anyhow, I told them that I didn't like the idea of the courtyard because it wasn't an active public space. And we went on and on and on. So the proposal I made to them was that we would actually build 4 classrooms on either side of the existing 2 classroom blocks and create a street between the 2, and then take the courtyard and wrap the courtyard on top of the classrooms and create this kind of elliptical, if you want to call it that, courtyard. So it's not a flat horizontal space, but it's a curved space. And tuck the classrooms on either side. What was quite nice was that the headmistress, who's quite smart, said to me, this is a perfect example of deconstructing colonial space in South Africa, which I thought was a rather smart way of seeing it. What she saw it was that the existing courtyard was serving no real purpose other than as a school courtyard. And she saw us as creating this new kind of courtyard space, which she saw as being much more useful. We built a model of it to show the kids, and this is what it is, so that you get this fantastic connection between the kids crisscrossing the courtyard every day, and then these 2 wings on either side, the one wing looking right up towards the mountain, the other wing looking towards the sea. And then the street that we created between the 2 blocks of classrooms, and then the classrooms themselves, which were very, very basic. So that was one way of dealing with landscape in Cape Town. Another project that we've recently completed is a museum up the west coast. Now, here's Cape Town. The west coast is in that direction, Namibia, and then, everyone else from Congo right the way through to Ghana, Nigeria, and so on. But what's interesting about this part of South Africa is that there's an area around over here where I know it's a hypothesis at the moment, but there's mounting evidence to show that this area is an area where we all come from, that there was a group of 60, 70,000 hominoids who lived in this part of our country many thousand years ago, from whom we are all descended. And so it's a really kind of important area. It's almost sacred in a sense, in the sense that it's the beginning of us as people, and this is where we come from. Anyhow, this part over here, which is where we built our museum, is an area that's very rich in fossils. and the fossil park grew up in this area. And it grew up in response to phosphate mining. This was a phosphate mine up on the west coast. And in the process of phosphate mining, this fantastic rich cache of fossils was found. They were 4.5, 5 million years old. It's probably one of the richest fossil finds in the world. And all work was halted, a trust was formed, and the land was given over to this trust, and they formed this fossil area, and we were called in with some money from the government to build a small museum and educational center to mark the site. And this, on the right-hand side, is the buildings that we developed, the education center, a small restaurant, and this museum. But what's important about it is that this over here is a mound of mining sand that's been highly refined. But underneath it runs this very, very powerful piece of stratigraphy. Stratigraphy is this layering of ground over many thousand years. In fact, if you stand over here, you can look at the cut through the ground, and you can see 5 million years of layering. But that stratigraphy was in fact buried underneath this big mound over here. So what we decided to do was to place our building in line of where we imagined stratigraphy line went. You can see it over here. And to make a cut through the mine sand, which mimicked that line of stratigraphy, and connect that to the reception area, which is where the cars and the tourist buses come, so that there was a kind of sense of remembering what that was about. It I think works rather nicely. The other thing that happened was, if I go back, this whole area here was an estuary 5 million years ago and filled up with water. And so what we did was we created a covered walkway which connected all these different elements together, but we made a thick wall, like a breakwater wall over here, which separated the activities of the center from the actual fossil field itself. And in a sense, that wall mimics the kind of breakwater wall that you would find along Sea Point or any of the resorts, coastal cities that we have, imagining that this was filled up with water. So there were a number of devices that we developed, and layering, etc., to give it that sense. The actual museum itself, I think, works very well in the sense that you enter at the top level and you move around it, around a double volume space. You drop down into the double volume space. You then move around that, and then you drop down into the basement where the children's display areas are. Then you move out of that onto the fossil field. So it's one of those very nice museums where you never retrace your steps. You're working under the pressure of gravity. You're dropping down all the time, and you exit in a very different place from where you entered. We built a series of models, and this is the continuation of that line of stratigraphy that I was talking to you about, with this thick wall that on the landward side that wraps around and contains the different buildings. The entrance, the education center, the entrance courtyard, and then that thick wall that I was talking to you about. A view into the museum from the top level. So you're looking down into the double volume space below, and then the double volume space itself. And this is a photograph that we took of the opening. It looks like a render, but it actually isn't. We used a very clever system that was developed in South Africa for art galleries and south lighting, which reduces UV to almost zero. So you don't get any shadows cast in the internal space, and you get a fantastic saving in terms of heat gain. We had a local artist who constructed these life-size models of civethias out of abandoned discarded pieces of wood. And he didn't cut one piece of wood to fit. It's really quite beautiful pieces. And then the building as it is in its setting, this is the center that is tucked into the side of the mine. the fossil, the place where you go and visit the fossils, and then this thick wall that I was talking to you about, and the building at night time. And this is the where you go and you view the fossils that are in the ground, that have been uncovered and left there as they were found. And it's quite remarkable to see these 5 million year old bones that have been fossilized and represent a variety of different kinds of animals. And this is a cover that we've designed for the dig site, which we built one of these days when we can raise the money, and we've used a system of rock stores to cool the air and cool the space naturally. We've been involved in some housing projects, which I thought I would talk to you about, which I think are interesting in as much as they were sponsored by groups outside of South Africa. The first one, which is this one, was sponsored by the Maxi Museum in Rome. And it was part of an exhibition that Pipochora held a number of years ago, which was called, The World Without Petrol. But it was an attempt to sort of get different architects around the world to imagine what it would be like to live in a world where we didn't have any petrol any longer. And that gave us an opportunity to look at, homebound industries, and where people didn't move great distances from where they lived to go to work. What has happened in South Africa in terms of housing is our government has done some remarkable things with housing in terms of numbers. 3.5 million houses have been built, another 1.5 million sites have been serviced. But what they've done is they've just simply done what the apartheid government did, which is to build 4-room boxes in the middle of nowhere, all in the wrong place. And this is a huge problem. So although there's a lot of pent-up energy amongst architects and others who would love to engage in the question of how to rethink our cities and to rebuild our cities, our government is doing nothing about it, because they're caught now in a cleft stick, because people have now come to expect that a 4-roomed house is a basic human right, and that's what they want. They want nothing other than that. And the government is bound by its desire to, keep in power to try and meet those needs. But what's happening is that they can afford to build less and less housing every year. And the result is that there's an explosion that's now happening in our cities. People are invading public land. They're building shacks on public parks and stuff like that. And I think we're going to go through the same process in South Africa as Brazil, Peru, and Chile went through in the 70s, not learning those lessons, unfortunately. This is Hart Bay, which is an area outside Cape Town, which is where I live, and there's this very nice fishing community that lives here, and they're generally quite poor people, and a lot of informal housing there. This is a view of Hart Bay with the Hungberg community behind. And these are the kind of houses that people have built. It's quite interesting, because it was originally settled, this area was settled by Portuguese boat builders. And there's still a couple of boat building shipyards there, but there seems to be a fantastic facility of being able to build out of timber. And they've developed some fantastically sophisticated techniques in building out of timber. And this is one of the examples you'll find. So what we did for the Maxi exhibition was we said that we wanted to leave the community as it was. We didn't believe that there was any point in trying to rebuild it, but that what we would try and do is bring in services. But we also understood that when you bring services to areas like this, you lose 40% of the houses, because you have to dig out gigantic big trenches in the ground for sewage and water, etc. So what we started off with looking at electricity and the upgrading of shack settlements in South Africa with electricity. And we came to the conclusion, which is quite obvious, that this is the easiest service to provide, because everything is overhead, and the only point of entry, only point of contact to the ground is the point where the pole hits the ground, where it finds its support. And it creates a minimum amount of disturbance. So we said, well, if that's the case, then can we not look at another way of bringing services to these areas where you don't disrupt the ground plane, but you bring it overhead? And what we did is we developed this idea of what we called an artificial tree machine, which was that we planted these artificial trees amongst the shacks, and we wanted to use the top level to plant vegetables, urban agriculture, to collect water. And at the base, we then developed a system of methane generation and water filtration so that these would become community collection points, and kept all the houses as they were currently in that area. This shows the kind of system of energy generation and water retention that we developed. And this gives an idea of how that area would look with these trees, which are artificial trees, but and I think do probably more work than a natural tree would do. I mean, I've had some arguments with landscape architects who've said, but trees are important elements in terms of carbon dioxide and this, that, and the other. And they're saying, well, these do the same thing because they have green canopies, but they're green canopies that you can eat, and that they do lots of other things. So that was an idea. We tried to get someone interested in the city in developing this as a prototype, and they weren't interested. And this is a drawing that we made for the exhibition, where at the top you can see Hungberg as it is, and below here you can see a tree planting exercise that we made, where we actually put our artificial trees down in between all the shacks rather than build new trees. So that was one housing project. The second one is one that we did a few years ago for the Herr Hassan Foundation in Berlin as part of an urban exchanger program, where we worked with a very good, a very fine Berlin architect who Rainer Hale, who's a professor at the Technical University in Berlin. And what we did is we looked at what is the minimum intervention that you need to make in an area of great poverty in terms of housing, where you look at how do you, what is the least bit of design that you can do. And what we did is we took this area in Philippi, and you can actually see the kind of things that we have to deal with in South Africa. This is over a 14-month period. This is the original settlement. This is 3 months later, and then this is, I think, another 8 months later. And it's just people move onto land, they occupy it, they put up a little demarcation of their site, and then they build. And this is happening in our cities all the time. It's like an explosion. And what we found in these areas was that the biggest difficulty that was now happening is the areas were becoming overcrowded, and people were now having to expand vertically because they were constrained laterally. And they just did not have the technical wherewithal or the means to be able to do that properly. So what we did is we said, let's look at what we called something that we called a Tafelhuis, a table house, which is just simply 4 legs and a little top. It's like a table, but what you do is you place the table on top of an existing shack. You then take the shack and put it on the top, and then you build a permanent house on the ground floor, and you can continue moving vertically. And we compared it to Laugier's primitive hut, which was a little bit cheeky of us. But this was really the idea. I think it makes a lot of sense, because what it does do is it provides you with a sturdy structure that's not going to fall down, it's not going to burn when fires break out, and it offers you the chance of expanding vertically. We developed the structure so that you could do it, you could go up 3 floors, and the cost of one of these table houses was the equivalent of about £300 sterling. So it's relatively inexpensive, and the ability to do it is well within the capability of people living in these communities. Everything can be bought from a local hardware store, precast planks, etc. And what we then did is we looked at 2 kinds of ways of how this might be done. One way where we would consolidate an existing community of houses and extend vertically and release some green space for either urban agriculture or for other uses. And then the other idea that we developed was an idea of making social housing, where the housing spaces were linked off a social street, a public street in the sky. This is the kind of technology that we used. These are the connectors between the columns and the actual steel beams that supported the precast planks. And you can see they're very simple. And these were built in that local community. I mean, people just built it. You've got welders and you've got people who can do this kind of work. It's quite easily within the capability of local people to do. And this is the house. The people who built it can be built in 7 days, of which 2 days are spent in construction. The other 5 days are waiting for the concrete to set. So it can be done in 7 days, and it can be done for the equivalent of 300 quid, which is not bad. And the proud homeowner standing there, and then the shack on top. And then, we took our eye off everyday practices and then learned a good lesson, because what was the first thing that this woman did was she rented out the space underneath the shack to someone to park their car. So parking a car then seemed to be more important than actually building that out of a permanent material. It was a good lesson for us. We're now in the process. We've taken a piece of ground in Philippi, and we're building an ideal homes exhibition, which we're trying to raise money for, and hopefully in the next couple of years we'll be able to develop this idea as a real nice three-dimensional set of spaces. But you can see here we've got the joining two of the modules together and then taking one vertically. I just wanted to very quickly is full of opportunities, and we are a country that's under huge change. And this is, for example, another project that we're involved in at the moment, which is we're working for some developers from Johannesburg who are buying up very old office buildings in Cape Town and converting them into hotels. And this is a 26-story office building that was developed along very strict modernist lines, certain width and a certain structural grid, a 7.5 meter structural grid, none of which works for either housing or hotel accommodation. And now it's run out of steam. They can't fill the building, and it's now being converted into a hotel by us. And this is what we're doing. We're adding, all sorts of things to it, cantilevered swimming pools and bars and things at the top, with beautiful views of Cape Town. But for me, what was very important about it was the challenge, and we've never faced this before, of taking an office building and then having to put the services in it for 650, 700 bedrooms. And this is what happens. I mean, it's just a servicing nightmare. I mean, and we were very lucky with the pandemic, because the pandemic came just at the time when we were starting to coordinate all our services, and no building could happen on the site for a 2-month period, which gave us 2 months to really resolve all the services. So now the services work quite sweetly. But you can imagine having to, in a building like this, fit in hot and cold water, air cooling, and fire, and all those other things. It's really quite a challenge. And this is the building. It's 650 rooms, and this is how we managed to fit the rooms in. 7.5 meter grid, which means that the clear space from between walls and rooms is 2.2 meters, which is very, very narrow. And we managed to get a tight little bathroom, and we took the wash and basin and the vanity outside of the bathroom, which meant that we could compress it even further. And what we did here, we now changed it. We had 2 very narrow stairs on either side of the bed, which were too narrow. So we pushed the bed to the one side. Now we've got a 7-meter odd stair on the one side. And then we, again, I don't understand what architects do in buildings, but they had a 1 meter high sill in this building. And from there, even if you're working at a desk, you can't see the view or anything. So we took the bed and we lifted it up and put it onto a timber deck. And so the top of the bed lines up at the top of the existing sill. You look out of the building and you've got a fantastic view. And that's, and that's what you come to Cape Town for. So now this hotel, when it opens, will offer a hotel bedroom, if anyone's interested, for the equivalent of 900 Rand a night, which is about £22 a night. So it's for nothing. But and what we're trying to do, which is, I think, going to affect the future of Cape Town, is we're trying to attract African people from the rest of Africa to come to Cape Town on holiday, which they haven't been able to do because Cape Town has pitched itself to the European and North American market, and it's priced the hotel accommodation out of the reach of people from Africa. This set of hotels that we're developing in Cape Town now is going to bring it within the reach of people from Africa. And hopefully we'll be able to consolidate Cape Town now as a place to visit for other Africans. When I spoke about one of our principles about adaptation and being able to adjust to different uses, this is a lesson I learned very early on in my career. And it's a really difficult thing because as an architect, you bring a building into being in order to satisfy a purpose. Someone says they want a house and you design a house. But then how do you design those spaces in the house so that it can become a clinic or it can become something else over time? And that's really, I think, the challenge that we've set for ourselves. This was a little 90 square meter house I did for a friend of mine, Dr. Teresa Nkumalo, from Alexandra Township many years ago in the mid to late 80s in Johannesburg. And just as we completed the house, she fell in love with a politician from Zimbabwe and then decided to get married and moved up to Harare to live with him and had this empty house and didn't know what to do with it. So she left it to her nephew, who was studying at Wits at the time. And what he did was he converted it into a fantastic shopping center, if you want to call it that. So the image on the left is the kitchen as it was, with the bedrooms above and the living room below. He's made this into a grocery store. He's made the living room below. He's got 2 pool tables there, so people can come and play pool. And then he converted the bedrooms above into bunk rooms and could sleep 9 people. And he made enough money out of running this business to put himself through university at Wits. And I'm really excited about that possibility that architecture can have, particularly in my part of the world where buildings, we can't afford to pull buildings down. Buildings must be used and reused for different purposes all the time. And yet we seem as architects so determined to keep the buildings that we designed located, to do one specific kind of use and unable to do anything else. This building is, I was very proud that my practice won the inaugural Lubetkin Prize for a museum we did in South Africa. And, Lubetkin has always been an architect whose work I've admired very much. And I love this building that he did, the Finsbury Centre in London. And I'm going to go very quickly through it, but he saw it as a way of bringing hope to people from the slums of London. And we're doing exactly the same thing in South Africa now, where we're doing a clinic in a place called Weltevreden Park, which is this part of the city. It's a crime-ridden, gang-infested part of the city, and we're building this new clinic which has got to serve a powerfully public symbolic purpose. And we've made a courtyarded building because you create a safe space in the center. It's a very, very simple building, but what we've been really struggling with has been trying to find a language for the building that will give it a signification as a public building. And I think we're getting there. And the city are very excited. The Department of Health are very excited about what we're doing, because I think we're really finally getting to grips with trying to make a clinic in a part of the city where people live in appalling circumstances. So it's clean, it's white, it's shiny, it feels hygienic. You come to it, you feel like you're in a clinic. I'm going to end off with, very quickly, I'm sorry I'm running out of time, a project we're doing for my wife's uncle, Dennis Goldberg, who was one of the Rivonia trialists who was jailed with Nelson Mandela. And he died recently. He's an extraordinary man. He spent 23 years in jail, all in this thing called a House of Hope in Hart Bay, which will be a place for young kids to come to, and they can learn through the experience of Dennis's life what sacrifice means for the common good, and they can also pick up other skills as well. But it's been an interesting project in the sense that Dennis died a while ago, and I'm, as a family member and also a trustee of the Dennis Goldberg Trust, have been left with the task of designing this building. So in a way, I'm designing it with some other architects. There's a friend of mine, Ian Lowe, who's working on the exhibition. and others people from my office, but we're effectively designing this building ourselves. We're bringing it together in memory of Dennis, at any rate. And these are some drawings that we've made, museum and some old buildings, and we're trying to wind its way through those buildings. I'm going to go very quickly through this. And this is the main exhibition space in the building, where Dennis's story will be told. In the green space there is a classroom where kids will be taught art. So it's both a gallery and a classroom all in one space, which is rather interesting. I'm going to end off very quickly by just showing you some houses that we do, which I think are very small. They're probably not more than, 100 meters, 150 square meters an area, but they act as experimental pieces of the work that we do. They're usually for friends, and they are usually very interesting buildings. We tend to attract interesting people to come to us, and they land up, we learn a lot of lessons. This is an interesting house because we tend to shy away from luxury houses, but this was an opportunity to do a very small house, but with a very high budget. And this was a house that was cast in white concrete, and it really is quite special and beautifully built, as you can imagine. This is essentially the conundrum that we face in South Africa. I'm sure you face it in the UK, they've certainly faced it in America under Trump and others, but this huge degree of inequality. I'm not sure what we can do about it as architects other than to be aware of it. But this little house here, which I've just shown you, which sits over here, could buy the equivalent of 1,000, that's right, 1,000 of my measure of, in the same city, someone can live in a house like that, and the value of that house can be the equivalent of 1,000 houses, which if you say took 4 persons per house would be 4,000 people. So there's something wrong with the world that we live in terms of how wealth is distributed and of the inequalities that exist. And that for me is the real challenge that we face in South Africa. And I don't know, as architects, we've got to work towards it. We all have our own ways, I think, by acting ethically, and I can talk about that, but I think I'm going to end my talk there. I think I've talked enough, and I think I'm just getting towards the end of my time. Okay, Alice, that's it.
Joe, thank you. That was absolutely spectacular. Perhaps if you unshare your screen, we can see you full size.
Share my screen. So how do I do it? Press the red one.
If you do stop sharing.
Okay, sure. Okay, there we go.
And we've got a question. There's a few coming in. So I'm going to just do some unmuting of people. Sally Sikaris, I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, Sally.
Hi, Joe. Question from another of your students of 30 years ago at WITS.
Oh, my God.
See you.
Hello.
Just a question about if you're advising the South African government about changing people's perceptions of what form of housing is a human right, what do you think the main thing you would be saying to them would be?
Well, I think the first thing is that the government is wrong in trying to centralize housing, because when you centralize housing through a national housing ministry, you land up building one single house type that you apply throughout the country. So it needs to be decentralized and local control. Cities need to take charge of it. Then what we need to do is we need to find other ways of describing the houses that are made, because the range of housing needs is infinite. Every family's housing needs are unique. So there's some people who want to rent, some people want to buy, some people want a house, some people want to, and we need to find the kind of measures that will be able to build into the system of housing production that kind of infinite variety. And we're not doing that at the moment. So what will happen, what's happening in South Africa is the government thinks they can control it. They can't. People are taking over public land. And I've argued this for the last 20 years. I'm really surprised at the goodwill of local people in Cape Town that they haven't started to invade the slopes of Table Mountain. They'll do it soon. And it will happen. And it's happened in other parts of the world. And and the government is just not prepared to accept it. They're full of all sorts of ideas about breaking new ground and this and that and the other. At the end of the day, it amounts to nothing. And I think that, they're very unimaginative. The other problem is, and this is a real problem, is that they don't see housing as a basic human right. They see housing as a commodity. What they do is they see the idea of building someone a four-roomed house as giving them a stake. So they can go to a bank one day and they can raise money through a mortgage and use that for other purposes. And I think we've got to see housing as much more than that. Housing is a vehicle for personal fulfillment and transformation. It's not a piece of something that you trade. So it's about values, and it's also about how we do it. And I think those two things will be forced on our government. They're not going to change. They're simply not going to change. It'll be forced on them by simply the society, the people who live in our country. And, who knows what will happen. It's happening at the moment. Today in Cape Town, we had a huge amount of activity in the Cape Flats where, people were, blockading roads and stuff like that, all about housing. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's answered your question, yeah.
We've got another one from Eunice. Eunice, I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, Joe. Thank you for that talk. That was really wonderful to hear your insight, especially on, I think, just thinking about the future of Africa. I personally am from Mozambique and Ethiopia, and I'm still in Chicago. I'm in my third year. And I guess something that I've been kind of playing around with a lot is this idea of vernacular characteristics and kind of like these ideas about, what are the identifying kind of features of design from certain parts of the world. So I was just wondering what you think of the future of like vernacular characteristics, maybe material or even just forms of South African architecture.
Yeah, I think when you mentioned vernacular architecture, immediately springs to my mind, rural buildings, which I think are the wrong way of thinking about it, in the sense that I think, if you remember, it was a very famous exhibition called Architecture Without Architects, which really looked at vernacular buildings and marveled at how wonderful they are. But they happened at a time when people were living in traditional societies where you had hundreds of years to perfect systems of design and construction. I think that, what we need to do if we want to look at how people live in, or if you want to look at how people make housing, we need to go into the shack settlements of our cities and look at how people in acts of desperation make space for themselves and start to try and understand how those processes work and to try and find ways of how we can actually reinforce those processes in positive ways and learn lessons from how people manufacture work. I mean, some students at UCT a couple of years ago, and I think Ian Lowe, who's I think part of this conversation, would probably be able to talk about it as well, actually went and studied the way in which building components are actually made in Cape Town at the moment, where you have people who stand by the side of the road who make a timber frame and they nail to that timber frame sheets of corrugated iron. And that forms a wall to a shack. And you can buy that on your way home from work and put it on top of the taxi. And if you want, you can even buy one with a window in it, or you can buy one with a door in it. And over time, you can collect 4 of those panels and you can make a little shack for yourself. Now, that's an extraordinarily, I think, sophisticated system of prefabrication that's happening, right in front of us. And yet, we don't seem to have the ability to find architectural ways of being able to translate that into something that's performs better, that doesn't burn when there's a fire, that's thermally more efficient, and that can also work in the same way as those panels can. So there are lots of clues, lots of things that you can find in everyday activities that are sitting there waiting for us to uncover and to develop. And a lot of the stuff that we're going to do is going to end in dead ends. I mean, this is not something that's a prescription for success. We've got to just try every avenue we can. We've got to experiment, and it's through experimentation and trying that we're going to find ways that will work, and that those ways can then be reinforced and become part of policy. But I think we're not doing that at the moment. We're just sitting back and just producing boxes. That's a real pity.
We've got one from Jay Ranpura.
Okay.
Hi, sorry, I'm Janaki. Oh,
Janaki.
I didn't fix my hair. I'm really sorry. Um,
I'm
so
fixing
I
my.
was you don't have to
I
worry.
haven't had a haircut for 3 months. Yeah.
It looks great. Beautiful analysis of what socioeconomic situation that you see around you and the kinds of inventions. Just wondering how you use.
Sorry, can you repeat that, Joe? Sorry, it didn't come through. Yeah. Could you
Sorry,
repeat
what?
what?
Yeah, how do you? What platforms you use besides your actual buildings to talk about the socioeconomic analysis that you've been expressing really beautifully?
Look, I used to teach, and then I reached retirement age a couple of years ago. So now I'm in practice, and we've got so much work that we're just building. And I've got this pent-up energy because I taught for so many years. I just want to build now. But I get stuff published, and I write pieces every now and then and go around. But I think if you came to South Africa, if you're interested, there are plenty of people in South Africa who are publishing and producing really good work. It's just that at the moment, I might be looking at it in a fairly depressing way. It seems to fall into void. It seems to fall into a void. There's no take up of it at all, and that's a real. But I think it's really because of the state that we find ourselves in South Africa. I'm hoping that this pandemic and our financial crisis will create a new set of conditions in South Africa, which will enable us to rethink where we want to be, because we just willy-nilly accepted a neoliberal path and said, right, let's just go full out, let's liberalize the economy, let's get people involved, let's develop entrepreneurism, or whatever it is that they call it, and it's got us nowhere. So, but I don't think we know what to do. It's if I was young, I'd come to South Africa because I think there are going to be huge possibilities here in the future. But what it's going to be and what form it's going to take is anyone's guess. I think no one really knows. We're all just speculating and shooting in the sky. But as far as platforms are concerned, I don't know, someone in my office, I'm an old fogey, so someone in my office operates Instagram for me, and we've got a web page, and that's about it. Okay.
We've got one from Tony Fretton.
Ah, hello, Tony.
Hi, Joe. Good to see you.
Hi. No, I remember.
Well, the first thing to say is that the work is as good and as beautiful as when I first saw it a long time ago.
Thank you.
One thing to say in response to what you've just said is that the value of the Architecture Foundation's online platform is that it reaches other areas which the conventional magazine culture doesn't go to, like South Africa. And so here's a question that's become vitally important in British education, which is what can you say about the growth and success of Black architectural practices in South Africa? And maybe some of those could be on this platform, which would be, I think, really enlightening. There's a big issue in Britain of example. We have student groups which have a high percentage of people of colour, and yet teachers are all white. So there's a real need for successful models, not in the UK necessarily, but worldwide. So if you can talk about that, that would be intensely valuable.
Yeah, look, Tony, the ANC's policy is policy of empowering Black people. And that runs through every aspect of work in the country. So to get work from the state, who is the biggest employer in South Africa at the present moment, you have to be a Black-owned business, or you have to employ Black people in your business. Now, one of the problems that the architectural profession has is we don't have enough Black architects in South Africa, because we only really started to attract Black architects after 1994. I think there's the thing is, unfortunately, these things take a long time to get traction. And I think that in the next couple of generations, we're going to see a cadre of black architects and planners emerge in South Africa who will be really formidable. There's some very good black architects in South Africa at the present moment. I don't deny that, but other races, you know, white architects, Indian architects, and others.
But Joe, let's put them on here.
Mhm.
Ellis would be susceptible to giving these people a platform outside South Africa. If you want to respond to Ellis with some suggestions,
Okay.
I'm speaking of, Ellis is nodding. This would be really good, and really good for your home country to get, for those guys to get approval outside their own sphere. I can tell you in my experience, recognition outside your own sphere is crucial to your well-being. And so let Ellis know who you would recommend, and let's see them on this platform.
No, we'll talk, Ellis, and I'll do what I can. Yeah.
That could be super valuable. And I know absolutely that there would be an audience, that our existing audience would be very interested. I think Tony's absolutely right about that. Joe, but thank you so much. What a fantastic talk, and a lot of work that I didn't know. And as Tony says, it's extraordinarily beautiful. I'm going to unmute everybody for a round of applause.